Have you ever sort of peered behind the curtain of global intelligence, wondered where that line is between, wanting to know the world and maybe having the impulse to change it, and what happens to the failures, the things that inevitably happen in those shadows? Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed. Today, we're taking a really deep look into the Central Intelligence Agency's, well, let's say tumultuous history. We're drawing heavily from Tim Weiner's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA.
Yeah, and this isn't just, another dry history. This book really pulls back the curtain on, 6 decades of CIA operations. It meticulously shows how the agency somehow kept this formidable reputation, in spite of its terrible record, essentially burying its blunders in top-secret archives. What makes it so compelling, I think, is how deeply researched it is. Weiner makes the point that every quote is also on the record.
And that commitment, being on the record, that really sets the stage for a truly critical look, doesn't it? So our mission today really is to dig into the big scandals, the leadership struggles, the huge foreign policy impacts, and yeah, the ethical knots that have defined the CIA basically since day one. Think of it like maybe two journalists just unpacking stacks of facts over a very strong coffee.
Okay, so let's crack open this archive. The book makes a pretty strong case that right from the get-go, the CIA was, well, complex, often contradictory. What was President Truman actually thinking? What was his original idea for this new agency?
Well, Truman's idea was actually remarkably simple. He wanted it to serve him, and this is key, solely as a global news service, delivering daily bulletins. He even wrote explicitly it was not intended as a cloak and dagger outfit. His vision was merely as a center for keeping the president informed on what was going on in the world. Simple as that.
A global news service, like a presidential inbox, sort of.
Yeah.
But that's not quite how it evolved, is it? And here's something that's really surprising from the book. The whole idea, the concept of a Central Intelligence Agency almost died before it even started.
It's quite a story, yeah. When Truman ordered the Wartime Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, to be abolished, a key figure, General Magruder, with help from Assistant Secretary of War John McCloy, they basically countermanded the president. Quietly, of course. They issued this order saying the continuing operations of OSS must be performed in order to preserve them. I mean, talk about keeping hope alive for a central agency.
Wow. Okay, so even with those embers kept alive, what was the actual state of U.S. intelligence in those early post-war years, it sounds like?
That's right. Oh, absolute chaos, really. Most of the experienced OSS veterans just packed up and left. So American intelligence was left, as the book puts it, transparently jerry-built and transient. Just thrown together. Sherman Kent, who later became a sort of founding father of the CIA's intelligence directorate, he called it a sadder or more tormented period of my life. The bottom line was there would be no coherent intelligence reporting in the American government for many years to come. Just fragmented pieces.
So just as the Cold War is heating up, the U.S. is effectively flying blind in a lot of ways. How did they even start to think about this new big enemy, the Soviets?
Well, George Kennan comes into the picture here. He'd soon become the Kremlinologist, right? The expert on the Soviet Union. Kennan argued the Soviets were only sensitive to one thing, the logic of force. And he also reflected that for this kind of thinking, the enemy must always be a center. He must be totally evil. That kind of black and white thinking really framed the whole early approach. Good versus evil, starkly put.
And the legal grounding for the CIA's growing power. Because it did grow quickly. The book points to some incredibly vague wording that became, well, a massive loophole.
That's exactly right. The National Security Act itself, the founding document, said nothing specific about secret operations overseas. Nothing. The authority for all the covert stuff, which, interestingly, the CIA's own lawyer, Lawrence Houston, warned was technically illegal without Congress saying, okay, it was hidden in just 11 words. Get this. Other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security.
That's it.
11 words.
11 words. And it wasn't just vague. You get the sense it was intentionally ambiguous. It allowed for this huge interpretation of power. Dean Acheson, for instance, wrote that he had the gravest forebodings. He warned Truman that no one would really be in a position to know what it was doing or to control it.
Okay, so you have this incredibly loose mandate. Unsurprisingly, the CIA jumps right into covert action, moving way beyond just gathering news. What were some of the first big moves? A really key early one was Italy, back in 1948. The CIA started, and I quote, purchasing elections and politicians with bags of cash. And according to the book, this wasn't a one-off. It was a tactic repeated in lots of other countries for the next 25 years. They also funded influential front groups like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, basically waging a kind of war of words, a cultural Cold War.
But the book really drives home that a lot of these early covert ops weren't just, ethically murky. They were often stunningly ineffective, and people got hurt badly.
Oh, absolutely. A really striking example is this collaboration with the Gehlen Group. This was a network run by a former Nazi intelligence chief, Reinhard Gehlen. Now, there were serious concerns internally about SS personnel with known Nazi records, and even fears the Soviets already knew this operation is going on. But the CIA took it over anyway. And just as feared, it was compromised right at the top. One officer summed it up with this absolutely chilling line: "American intelligence is a rich blind man using the Abwehr as a seeing eye dog."
Wow. Using the Nazi intelligence service as a guide dog. And then there are these operations the book calls suicide missions, places like Albania, Korea. Those stories are rough.
They really are. The book details how agents dropped into Albania in 1949 were just quickly eliminated. Why? Because the Soviets had known every aspect of the operation from the start, total penetration. And similarly, in Korea, paramilitary operations were described as not only ineffective, but probably morally reprehensible in the number of lives lost, just throwing lives away. The book reveals that many missions weren't sent for intelligence. Think about that. They were sent to supply non-existent or fictitious resistance groups. And almost all the supposed secret information they gathered, it was actually manufactured by the North Korean and Chinese security services, complete fabrications fed back to the CIA.
So these weren't just mistakes, they were fundamentally flawed, based on bad intel, incredibly costly in human lives. Given these early, frankly, disastrous failures, how did covert actions still become the go-to tool for U.S. foreign policy? Especially under someone like Eisenhower, who the book says bet the fate of the nation on his nuclear arsenal and his spy service. Let's talk Iran and Guatemala.
Yeah, under Eisenhower, covert action really became the weapon of choice. In Iran, 1953, the British, specifically Churchill, wanted Iranian oil back under their control after Mossadegh nationalized it. So the CIA, led in the field by Kim Roosevelt, FDR's grandson, effectively made U.S. policy by default to overthrow Prime Minister Mossadegh. The first try actually failed because Mossadegh knew it was coming. But the CIA regrouped with a hastily assembled cadre of Iranian colonels and ultimately succeeded. And the book really emphasizes the long shadow of these things. Apparent short-term wins, sowing decades of resentment, and, as it says, cruel consequences. Anti-Americanism that's still potent today.
And then Guatemala, 1954, Operation Success. Partly driven by, let's be frank, the interests of the United Fruit Company.
Yes, absolutely. That operation involved a deliberate terror campaign. The goal was to terrify Arbenz, particularly, to terrify his troops. It led to the bombing of a country that, the book notes, had never been bombed before. But what's really telling is how the story spun afterwards. This narrative of brilliant spycraft was, quote, a bald-faced lie. In reality, the CIA completely missed the boat on a crucial arms shipment that could have totally changed the situation on the ground. They got lucky, essentially.
And the book suggests these early successes, even if built on lies or luck, really solidified the CIA's image of itself, maybe led to a bit of arrogance.
Definitely. There's this 1956 internal review called the Bruce Report. It really nailed this dynamic. It described how covert ops were becoming more and more exclusively the business of the CIA. And it noted the agency was busy, moneyed, and privileged, and that it likes its king-making responsibility. It pointed to these bright, highly graded young men who must be doing something all the time to justify their reason for being. It paints a picture of an agency almost hooked on intervention, needing to constantly do something.
Which leads us to something really chilling. The Hungarian uprising in 1956. The book highlights how the CIA's Radio Free Europe directly encouraged a revolt, which was then brutally crushed by the Soviets, with absolutely no Western help coming.
It's a really stark example of the dangers of psychological warfare, isn't it? Radio Free Europe was broadcasting calls for freedom or death. They even gave instructions like how to throw Molotov cocktails on the grated ventilation slit over the engine of Soviet tanks. This created the promise that help would come. But help never came. It was devastating. Frank Wisner, who was head of covert operations then, was reportedly near a nervous breakdown, just raging, drinking heavily because people were dying as the agency dithered. It raises this huge ethical question, right, about the responsibility you bear for the information you put out there in covert psyops, especially when it incites people to risk their lives based on false hope.
Moving forward, as the Cold War really digs in, the CIA faces its next big test, the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. The book paints a picture of just terrible misjudgment, communication breakdowns, a total mess.
Oh, it was a disaster. The secrecy around the operation, it was blown long ago. Everyone knew something was up. Yet Richard Bissell, the head of the clandestine service, he just refused to acknowledge that the CIA could not topple Castro. He was this kind of institutional denial. Then President Kennedy pulled the plug on crucial airstrikes on D-Day itself. That was probably the final nail in the coffin. The commander on the beach was desperately radioing back. Do you people realize how desperate the situation is? Do you back us up or quit? Just heartbreaking. And a very public failure.
And that failure, that very public disaster, led to some really sharp thinking about covert action itself and about having these kinds of powers in a democracy.
Yeah. General Walter Bedell Smith's testimony after the Bay of Pigs is incredibly relevant, even today. He basically asked, how can a democracy wage war using permanent, extraordinary secret powers? He suggested that when the war is over, those rights and powers that were temporarily delegated should go back. They should revert. It just perfectly captures that fundamental tension, doesn't it, between needing secret intelligence and the principles of democratic accountability, and how hard it is to take power back once you've given it away.
So connecting the dots here, the book argues the CIA just kept stumbling into these misjudgments. And this pattern, tragically, leads right into the full-blown disaster of Vietnam.
The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 is just a textbook case of intelligence being twisted to fit policy. The entire Vietnam War escalation was authorized based on a supposed unprovoked attack on U.S. ships. The book flat out calls this a bald-faced lie. It shows how NSA intelligence was deliberately skewed, manipulated to support the notion that there had been an attack. Years later, President Johnson himself reportedly admitted, hell, those damn stupid sailors were just shooting at flying fish. It just shows that dangerous dynamic. Political leaders wanting a specific answer from intelligence, not the objective truth.
And the Vietnam War itself just became this absolute nightmare for the CIA leadership trying to navigate it.
Richard Helms, who was the director of Central Intelligence then, he later pointed to fundamental problems. Our national ignorance of Vietnamese history, society, and language. Just basic lack of understanding. And also, he admitted, our failure to penetrate the North Vietnamese government. They didn't know what the enemy was thinking. Even worse, the intelligence analysis itself became corrupted. Why? Because political leaders kept pressuring the agency for good news about the war. So the CIA ended up producing reports that, internally, the book says they did not believe. They were just telling Washington what it wanted to hear. That's the ultimate corruption of intelligence, isn't it?
Moving into the 70s, the book shows how the CIA's focus, which was supposed to be external, turned inward, spying on Americans. Operation CAIOS.
Yeah, that's a really shocking part of the story. Under Nixon, the CIA was directly ordered to spy on American citizens, tapping phones, opening first-class mail, even, the book says, conspiring to commit murder, all completely outside the agency's legal charter. This actually led to some pushback from within. Director James Schlesinger later issued this directive, basically telling every employee to report any activities outside CIA's charter. It forced this confrontation, about where the line is between national security and civil liberties. And can the agency even police itself?
And the 70s, of course, brought Watergate, much more public scrutiny, and the CIA got tangled up in that too.
Oh, definitely. The book confirms a CIA veteran, James McCord, was one of the Watergate burglars. And Richard Helms, the director at the time, he famously warned the White House, if this break-in gets linked back to the CIA, every tree in the forest will fall. He knew how damaging it could be. It gets worse. Nixon's counsel actually ordered the CIA to find hush money for the burglars, using its secret black budget. The ethical lines were just completely blurred right up to the top.
But maybe even more shocking than the external scandals in terms of systemic failure was the Aldrich Ames betrayal, an insider turning traitor.
That was just catastrophic. Aldrich Ames, a career CIA officer, he sold every name he knew to Moscow for about $2 million. Destroyed our entire Soviet agent network. What's truly mind-boggling and point to a massive internal problem is this. Despite all the warning signs, bells and whistles going off, agents disappearing, operations failing, it took the CIA 7 years to even begin to face the possibility of a mole high up.
7 years.
7 years. Ames himself, when caught, apparently smirked about the agency's inability to investigate itself. He said, you can't monitor it, you can't control it. That speaks volumes about accountability or the lack of it inside such a secret world.
So the Cold War finally ends. You'd think maybe a reset, some clarity, but the book argues it just brought new challenges and, sadly, more failures. Iran-Contra really stands out.
Yeah. The Iran-Contra affair had CIA Director Bill Casey, who's often painted as this sort of freelance buccaneer, secretly funding the Contra wars in Central America with foreign money, taking, as the book says, a great risk for Reagan and the agency. And he pushed ahead with these secret arms for hostage deals with Iran, even after his own agency had put out a burn notice, a formal warning saying a source is unreliable, on the main Iranian middleman, Manuka Ghorbanifar. The agency literally called Ghorbanifar an intelligence fabricator and a nuisance. Yet Casey still dealt with him. It just shows this pattern of high-level officials ignoring their own intelligence when it didn't fit their plans.
And this period also saw the very dangerous unintended consequences of supporting certain groups in Afghanistan during the Soviet war there, the whole blowback phenomenon.
Right. In Afghanistan, the CIA heavily backed the Mujahideen factions, who were the most committed Islamists, because they were seen as the best fighters against the Soviets. As one CIA officer later admitted almost hauntingly, no one dreamed that the holy warriors could ever turn their jihad against the United States. It really hammers home that critical point about the end game, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Another CIA officer, McMahon, is quoted saying, "You always have to think of the end game before you start it, and we don't always do that." A huge recurring blind spot.
And then, of course, 9/11, which the book describes just chillingly as the Pearl Harbor that the CIA had promised to prevent.
Yeah. Despite warnings that were apparently pouring in from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, Jordan and Israel, all over Europe, the system failed. The CIA's own frayed circuits were dangerously overloaded. The book also mentions, kind of disturbingly, that the White House had studiously ignored a CIA study predicting 500,000 deaths in the Rwandan genocide just a few years earlier. It suggests a wider problem of ignoring warnings before 9/11. After the attacks, President Bush gave the CIA new and extraordinary authority. This included turning kidnapped suspects over to foreign security services known for interrogation and torture. That opened a whole new, very dark chapter.
And that new authority, that new mindset, led almost directly to the massive intelligence failure over Iraq and weapons of mass destruction.
It's just a monumental failure. The CIA officially confirmed the White House's claims about WMDs, despite having, the book says, less than a handful of actual Iraqi sources providing that information. They basically produced a ton of analysis from an ounce of intelligence, just spun gold from straw. Colin Powell's big UN speech, the one that convinced so many people, we now know it was based on falsehoods cloaked as hard truths supplied by the CIA, often based on that flimsy sourcing. The DCI at the time, George Tenet, later conceded the CIA was wrong simply due to incompetence. He admitted, flat out, we didn't get the job done. It's like an echo of all the earlier failures, amplified. Political pressure, confirmation bias, bad intelligence.
So looking back at this whole 6-decade history, what's the book's final take on the state of the CIA in the 21st century?
It's pretty grim, actually. The book quotes a later DCI, Porter Goss, saying the CIA he inherited was in ruins, broken, and incapable of even the slightest bit of success. Strong words. It criticizes the agency's shift away from deep strategic intelligence towards just reacting to spot news. And it points again to that chronic lack of linguistic and cultural expertise needed for real understanding. Perhaps the most damning insight is that the myth of a golden age of the CIA, a myth largely created by Alan Dulles' own PR back in the 50s, paradoxically made the agency impervious to change. It couldn't learn from its mistakes because it believed its own hype.
So after all this, what does it mean for us? For the public, the CIA is supposed to protect. This deep dive into Legacy of Ashes really paints this picture of an agency constantly caught between its mission to know the world and this powerful impulse to change the world, often with, disastrous results.
Yeah, it really highlights this recurring cycle, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Intelligence failures, from those early botched operations right up to the Iraq WMD mess. And this constant struggle to get meaningful oversight in a system built on secrecy. It brings up that fundamental question. How can a democracy really control its secret operations when, as the book puts it so starkly, success cannot be advertised, failure cannot be explained? Where's the accountability?
Exactly. And that phrase from Eisenhower, that warning about leaving a legacy of ashes, it really sticks with you after reading this account.
It really does. And it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? Given this history, these repeated blunders, the ethical compromises, the struggles with accountability, what would real oversight even look like for an intelligence agency? How do we get effective intelligence that actually protects national security and upholds democratic values without falling for that allure of unchecked power and total secrecy? And maybe what's our role as citizens who know this history in demanding that balance?